محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على
اللهم صل على
محمد وآل
محمد وعجل فرجه. Inshallah. If you can let me know if you guys can hear me, inshallah, we'll go ahead and get started.
Yes, inshallah we can.
Inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين، واللعنة الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. قال لا تثريب عليكم اليوم، يغفر الله لكم وهو أرحم الراحمين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. We will continue, inshallah, tonight's discussion with the discussion that we had started last night, and that is the issue of relatives and how the Ahlulbait treated their relatives. We delved into this topic yesterday to first establish the very concept and the importance and this obligation that we have towards our relatives. We spoke about the different words of the Quran referring to the concept of relatives, and we spoke about the verses of the Quran that rank the importance of connecting with relatives near the concept of Tawheed. Multiple verses of the Quran have spoken about this. We also talked about the results and the spiritual effects, what happens in the life of a person when they maintain their family ties, and vice versa, what happens if someone were to cut off these family ties, if someone were to cut off these relationships. Then we delved into more of the discussion where we understood from Islam that yes, Islam emphasizes the importance of these relationships, but this does not mean that the believer doesn't have any opportunity to manage and balance these relationships. There are times where you might come across a person who is difficult to spend time with amongst your relatives. There are times you might come across a person who is negative, for example, a person who even sometimes backbites, for example, or has other issues. Islam has taught us that we are not allowed to cut off family ties from such an individual completely, but this doesn't mean that I do not have permission to balance and manage my relationship with this individual. Meaning that if there is another relative of mine that I get along with very well, there's nothing stopping me from spending more time with that individual within the relatives while I maintain a minimal level of my relationship with all of my relatives. We said even beyond that, it's not even just a matter of keeping a little bit of distance. Sometimes it is necessary for us to set boundaries with relatives. There are times where a relative of ours may have a different value system. There are times where this person might want to now become a bit nosy and want to intervene and interfere in my day-to-day life. Or they may not know how to interact with me. And this is where the concept of drawing boundaries with the utmost respect and with manners comes into the picture. And we also mentioned that there were relatives of the Prophet who were amongst his greatest supporters, and there were relatives of the Prophet who were considered a test for the Prophet. This is where we ended yesterday. Inshallah, tonight we will continue with the discussion, and we will pose the following questions and provide answers to them. Number one, did the Prophet spend the same amount of time with all of his relatives, or were there certain relatives that he would spend more time with and some relatives that he would spend less time with? Number two, how did the Prophet treat his relatives who wronged him for more than 20 years after the Prophet conquered the city of Mecca? Number three, should I support my relatives? And this is now the other extreme. Should I support my relatives no matter what the cost and no matter what position they take? This is the other side of the spectrum. There are those who are not there for their relatives. There are those who will support their relatives at any cost and regardless of what position their relative has taken. Number four, the Quran, when it speaks of the person who will be handed his book of deeds behind his back, min wara'i dhahrihi, the Quran, what reason does the Quran mention for this person ending up in this situation? We know on the Day of Judgment, people are of two types. Some, their book of deeds will be handed to their right hand, some from behind their backs. The Quran explains why this person ended up in this situation where his book is being given to him behind his back. And number five, if my family and my relatives turn away from me, if they don't support me, then who am I supposed to rely on? In other words, who is my true family and who is my true rahim? These are the questions that inshallah we will delve into and provide answers to tonight with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Allow me to begin from here. We said that Islam has allowed us and given us the authority to manage the relationships that we have, to balance the relationships that we have with our relatives while maintaining a minimal level of our family ties. In the hadith that we read yesterday from Imam al-Sadiq salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi, he said, "Silu arhamakum walau bit-taslim." Visit your relatives, check up on them, maintain your family ties, even if at the very, very minimal level. This means that when you come across them, you don't turn away from them, you greet them, you welcome them. Even if this person is not too warm, even if this person is not too welcoming, this minimal level of family ties needs to be maintained regardless of who your relative is going to be. And this is what you also find in the fatwa of our Maraji. Ayatollah Sistani, for example, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prolong his life, his ruling is exactly this, that when you come to your relatives, that you are to maintain these family ties at least at this minimal level. If this relative of yours is in dire need, that at least in those situations, you try to support this person, you try to help this person as much as you can. Having understood that, when you look at the life of the Prophet, you find that his relationships were not all the same with his relatives. There were relatives of the Prophet that he used to spend time with every single day, and there were relatives of the Prophet who he may have not been spending as much time with. And amongst those relatives and those relationships that were extremely critical and crucial for the Prophet, they were very special for the Prophet, was his relationship with Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. This beloved cousin of the Prophet, you find that in the ahadith, Ali ibn Abi Talib himself says this, and this is now after the Prophet has passed away. He starts to show us a little bit of a window and starts to unveil a little bit of the relationship that he used to have with the Prophet. Now imagine this is after the Prophet has passed away and people have come, they have wronged Ali ibn Abi Talib, they have said certain things about him, they have questioned whether he was the first to believe in Islam, they have questioned whether he has the knowledge to lead the Muslimin, and so on and so forth. You find that Ali ibn Abi Talib, in some of his khutbahs, he says this. He says, everyone knows this. All of these ashab know this. وَقَدْ كُنْتُ أَدْخُلُ عَلَى رَسُولِ اللَّهِ كُلَّ يَوْمٍ دَخْلَةً وَكُلَّ لَيْلَةٍ دَخْلَةً. Everybody knows that every single day I used to sit with the Prophet, and every single night I used to sit with the Prophet. This is the relationship that Ali ibn Abi Talib has with the Prophet. Is this the same relationship that he has with his uncle, for example, with others? No, this one is special. This one is different. فَيُخْلِينِي فِيهَا أَدُورُ مَعَهُ حَيْثُ دَارَ. When I used to go sit with him, he used to ask others to leave, and it used to just be us. And whatever he would do, I would walk in his footsteps, meaning that I was learning from him every second. He was raising me. And then he continues, وَقَدْ عَلِمَ أَصْحَابُ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أَنَّهُ لَمْ يَصْنَعْ ذَلِكَ بِأَحَدٍ مِنَ النَّاسِ غَيْرِي. And the companions of the Prophet know that there was no other individual amongst the companions of the Prophet that the Prophet used to spend this much time with. He continues, he says, there were many times where I used to go and sit with the Prophet. There were many times where the Prophet used to come to my house. This is special now. Usually a teacher, yes, someone you're going to learn from, you have to go to them. But the hadith of Ali ibn Abi Talib says, sometimes I used to go, sometimes the Prophet used to come to me. This is very special. And then he continues to explain. He says, when the Prophet used to come to me and when I used to come to him, there was a slight difference. He says, when I used to go to the Prophet, when I would sit in the house of the Prophet would ask his wives to get up and leave, in the sense that he would ask that this be a private gathering, just me and him sit there. But he says, when the Prophet used to come to my house, he would not ask Fatima and Hassan and Hussein to get up and leave. It was a different situation when the Prophet used to come to our house. These individuals, this is Ahlulbait. And then he ends with this. He says, وَكُنْتُ إِذَا سَأَلْتُهُ أَجَابَنِي. It was such that whatever questions I had, I would ask him, he would respond. وَإِذَا سَكَتْتُ عَنْهُ. And if there came a time where I was quiet, وَفَنِيَتْ مَسَائِلِ, and my questions finished, ابْتَدَأَنِي. He himself would start the discussion and he would teach me himself. I ask you, brothers and sisters, is the Prophet having the same type of relationship with all of his relatives, or is he giving priority to some relationships over others? Is he spending more time with certain people, with others, while maintaining family ties with everybody? So Islam has taught us that we can manage these family ties. As much as Islam has told us about this, another right that your relatives have upon you that we find in the seerah of the Prophet is this, that as much as you are forgiving when it comes to other people, as much as you are willing to be patient, as much as you are willing to be forbearing when it comes to other people, when it comes to your relatives, your patience and your forgiveness should be even more. Where do we see this in the seerah of the Prophet? We said this yesterday. All of us have relatives at times who are tested. We are tested with them. They are relatives that create difficulties for us. They create problems for us. Sometimes, God forbid, they backbite. Sometimes, God forbid, they are a means of annoyance for us. Or at times, you'll find relatives have this towards one another. Sometimes this one creates problems for the other one, and vice versa. We are not ma'asum of this either. We are not infallible when it comes to this either. Sometimes, God forbid, we make these mistakes as well. But Quran and Hadith teaches us that if you're forgiving towards other individuals, towards a stranger, then your forgiveness when it comes to your relatives should be even greater while you draw boundaries with them. But at the same time, your forgiveness should be even greater. Because we find this in the seerah of the Prophet, that when the Prophet, he came to Mecca and he conquered Mecca, what happened? These were relatives of his. Let's put this into context, brothers and sisters. Many of us think that when the Prophet conquered Mecca, then he went on to move back to Medina and govern the Muslim Ummah for years. This is not what happened. When you look at the history of the life of the Prophet, the conquering of Mecca, it took place, some say around, the main opinion is the 8th year after Hijrah. This means what? This means 13 years in Mecca, the relatives of the Prophet were creating problems for him, were persecuting himself, his family, his companions. 13 years. And then add another 8 years to that. 20 plus years, the relatives of the Prophet were creating problems for him. And then you find that even when the Prophet did come and enter into Mecca, these relatives still, they did not accept the message of the Prophet, except when they saw the greatness of the army that the Prophet had brought. And therefore, the people who came into Islam, entered into Islam, many of them from Bani Umayyah at that time, These individuals, some of them you can say that their iman was not truthful because they accepted Islam because they saw the greatness of the army. When you look at the way the Prophet strategically managed the situation, that before entering into Mecca, he set up camp outside of Mecca. And people were bringing news. And when he set up camp, he asked the people who were part of his army to start fires. And these fires were so many that they say Abu Sufyan came out of Mecca and he thought that Bani Hawazin, which was another tribe, another big tribe, was going to attack. He didn't think this is the army of Islam until he actually came and he realized these are the Muslims. And what happened? Before the Prophet even entered Mecca, you find Abu Sufyan is in the tent of the Prophet, because the Prophet strategically planned this. But this is now his relative. His relative is not going to accept Islam just because of Islam. Even in these final stages, he's going to accept because he sees this huge army. But now take a look at the forgiveness of the Prophet. Take a look at Rahmatan lil Alameen, what he's going to do. Because they say when the day came that the Prophet that entered into Mecca, and according to the famous opinion, this is the 20th of the month of Ramadan. Many of the famous dates in Islamic history have actually taken place in the month of Ramadan. Conquering of Mecca is one of them. The Battle of Badr is another one of them, and many other events as well. The 20th of Ramadan comes around, and the Prophet is now going to enter into Mecca. Abu Sufyan returns to Mecca. And when this army, and everyone knows that the army is so great, there's no chance of you fighting. Abu Sufyan is not going to put together an army at this point. He knows that he won't be able to stand in the presence of this army. They say that this army started to march into Mecca. And when it started to march into Mecca, they say that Abu Sufyan, one of the companions of the Prophet, passed by Abu Sufyan. He turned to Abu Sufyan. He said, Abu Sufyan, are you ready for today? Al-yawm yawmul malhama. Today is the day where we take revenge. Today is the day where we're going to shed blood. The way you shed blood from us, we're going to shed blood from you. And as this army marched forward, then the Prophet came and passed by Abu Sufyan. And Abu Sufyan asked him, he said, Ya Rasulullah, your companion said, today is the day of revenge. Is this true? And the Prophet said, no, he was wrong. Al-yawm yawmul marhama. Today is the day of mercy. Today is the day that I forgive you all. So they say when the Prophet entered into Mecca, first of all, he had appointed a number of places where you can go. And if you go to these places, there is no threat to your life whatsoever. And we know that the Prophet entered into Mecca and the people gathered around the Kaaba. And he turned to them. He said, you tell me what I'm supposed to do with you. How do you think I am going to treat you? They said, Ya Muhammad, you are our relative. We know how great you are. We know how kind and forgiving you are. We have never seen anything but good from you. And the Prophet responded, he said, I will say to you what Yusuf said to his brothers. La tathriba alaykum al-yawm, yaghfirullahu lakum. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive you. This is easy for us looking back 400 years in hindsight, saying, yes, the Prophet forgave his relatives. These were relatives for 20 years who were creating problems for the Prophet and for Islam. And yet you find the Prophet, these 20 years, it took him 20 seconds maybe to forgive all of these relatives of his. So as much as we show forgiveness to strangers, this forgiveness is even more emphasized when it comes to my own relatives. These are some of the rights that our relatives have. Some we covered today, some we covered yesterday. Now we're going to transition into the answer of the third question, and that is this. On the other hand, does this mean that I have to support my relatives at any cost? Does this mean I have to support my relatives no matter what position they take? This is the other side of the spectrum. This is the other extreme. One extreme is where I sit with my relatives. The moment I don't like what this one says, I cut off ties. And the moment I don't like this one may not be very religious, so I cut off ties with this one. And this one, I cut off ties. This is one extreme. The other extreme is the extreme where now my relatives become a god for me. They become an idol for me. Now I support my relatives no matter what they do, good, bad, evil, doesn't matter. Because he is my cousin, because he is my second cousin, because this is my uncle, my aunt, my niece, my nephew, I'm going to support them no matter what. This also Islam had a serious problem with. And this is what we find in the literature of Islam. Sometimes it's referred to as a asabiyya, tribalism. Sometimes it's referred to as hamiyya, refers to somewhat of the same concept. This is different words, different meanings, but somewhat of the same concept. This racism that we speak of today, that a person will stand behind his own race, during the time of the Prophet, it manifested itself more in the form of tribalism, meaning that if this person came from your tribe, it's what mattered. Of course, today, it's more revolving around the idea of race, which is a more general way of categorizing individuals. But during that time, this was a major, major issue. And the Quran speaks about it. It says, some of you, that you still have hamiyat al-jahiliyyah. You still have this sense inside of you that if someone from my tribe says something, I have to support him no matter what. And continuously throughout the history of Islam, you will find that this was an issue that the Prophet had to continuously tell the Muslims to eradicate this habit from their hearts. It's not easy. It's a difficult thing to do, brothers and sisters. But you find Quran and Hadith have emphasized this so much. That yes, you're supposed to support your relatives, but if they take the wrong position now, then getting behind them is going to become a problem. Yes, you find, for example, the verses of the Quran say, this is Surah An-Nisa, verse 135. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. O you who believe, kunu qawwamina bil qisti shuhada'a lillah. When they ask you to come and share a testimony, you know that during the time of the Prophet, many of the decisions that were made in court, they were made based on testimony. Many of the rulings that we have today in Islamic law, that they say, oh, you need for this, you need two people to come and give testimony, 2 witnesses, and this one 4 witnesses, and this one 3 witnesses. Many of these, in the same way that they used to apply at that time, in the same number that they used to apply at that time, they don't apply today as often as they do, in the sense that today, the idea of bringing forth witnesses is something that doesn't happen too often. And this is because the world that we live in, yes? Usually it's other proofs that are brought forward, okay? It's not the testimony that's brought forward. But during the time of the Prophet, many things were decided based on testimony, of course, testimony of a just individual, not just any individual. The Quran says when you are brought, and I'll explain how this relates to our lives today, and brothers and sisters, how this is an issue that has plagued our communities today. This is an issue that we have today in our lives. The Quran says when they bring you forth for testimony, be truthful in your testimony. وَلَوْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ, even if you're giving testimony against yourself, أَوِ الْوَالِدَيْنِ أَوِ الْأَقْرَبِينَ. Even if you're giving testimony against your own parents, or you're giving testimony against your relatives, be truthful in your testimony. How does this affect our lives today? You say, Shaykh, well, I was never brought into court to give testimony. No, many times disputes happen in our communities, many times. And you go to this person and you say, brother, what do you think happened? And then all of a sudden you'll see this person will start changing the story. Why? Because his cousin is involved. Because, his uncle is involved, his aunt is involved, his niece, nephew. It can go, this can go any which way you think about it, any relative, young for old, old for young. It can happen any way. This is a problem. And many times, many disputes that never get solved in our communities, the root of it goes to this. It's a form of tribalism. It's a form of supporting my relative because it's my relative. At no matter the cost, no matter the position this person takes. Because he's related to me, I can't go against him. I can't take away my support from him. Who said that? Where does that come from? Quran and Hadith? No. You find this in the culture of the Arab of that time. They used to believe in this tribalism to a point where they used to, and you find this in the history, that when 2 people used to fight with one another, this wasn't the problem. It's 2 people fighting with one another. It's just an argument. The problem was when this person and this person would call their tribe was obligated to support them no matter what. So if someone came and slapped one person and this person slapped this person back, but then they called their tribes, then 2 tribes were fighting against one another. And this was what happened with Aus and Khazraj in Medina before the Prophet came. And even after the Prophet came, you find that still these feelings were there. And still these feelings would bubble up every now and then. That every now and then Aus and Khazraj, they would get into these debates again. And sometimes it was munafiqun that would start these debates. And sometimes these debates, and when I say this debates, I mean arguments that were going to lead to a civil war in Medina. You know, a fight in Medina, the capital of the Prophet, is going to be threatened by this. This is how serious this was. And you find that these people, they would count on their tribe so much that at times they would go to the point where they would go to the graveyard and they would count how many more graves they have over the other tribe to show how great their family is. And the Quran says, "Alhaakum takathur hatta zurtumul maqabir." You guys are so stuck in this tribalism, you even go to the graveyards and count the graves that you have. And we don't do this today. But that's a question for you and me, brothers and sisters. How does this implement itself in our lives today? Because there are many times where we will say something simply because this person is my relative, simply because this person is my cousin. And this is a problem. Even after the Prophet came, this continued to be a problem. And specifically, when Muslims started to enter into Islam, the problem they had, sometimes their mother, sometimes their father, sometimes their uncles, sometimes their nieces, nephews, were still in the lines of the kuffar. And that's why the Quran had to continuously remind them, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, la tattakhidhu aba'akum wa ikhwanakum awliya. If your father, mother, brother, sister, child, whatever the case is, if he's on the wrong path, this is your test. You can't sit there and say, well, I'm going to support this cause because my relative is over there, because my relative is on the other side. No, this is your test. And the Quran says, قُلْ إِنْ كَانَ آبَاؤُكُمْ وَأَبْنَاؤُكُمْ. If your relatives are so important for you, meaning that you're willing to support evil because your relative says so, then know that the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to come. فَتَرَبَّصُوا حَتَّى يَأْتِيَ اللَّهُ بِأَمْرِهِ. This is a serious threat for us, brothers and sisters. This continued to show itself throughout the history of the life of the Prophet, so much so that after the Prophet passed away, this was one of the main and key factors in the political and societal incidents that took place after the Prophet passed away. After the Prophet passed away, we know that Ali ibn Abi Talib was placed in a very vulnerable situation. There were many who turned away from him, or at least you can say there were many who did not support him. Why? Because when you go and look into history, you find that Ali ibn Abi Talib, he had at many times killed in battles individuals from the relatives of the same individuals who won't support him now. This is something that will present itself again and again in our lives. And this is something that we have to understand. Sometimes it's a matter of someone doing something wrong in my relatives, someone having the wrong position. Islam tells me that I cannot support this individual. And as I will mention in just a second, you will find that even the prophets were tested with this as well. This is one form where our relatives become a test for us. This is different from what we were talking about yesterday. Yesterday, you have a relative who creates problems for you. This is not a relative who creates problems for you. This is a relative who is doing evil and he expects you to support it. And this is where Islam is looking at you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is looking at you and me to see whether you will support this individual or not. Then another form where this individual becomes a test for me is where it's not a matter of me supporting him per se. It's me doing things based on the fact that this is what our relatives do. Me sinning, me committing a sin, me living a sinful lifestyle because this is how our family does things. This is a problem for us again as well. What does this mean? This means that I look amongst my relatives and I say, okay, well, how do people have their weddings done? Okay, this is how they have their weddings done. Yes, there's this type of music and dancing and brothers and sisters are mixing, yes. And you know, the bride comes in the presence of hundreds of men and this is how our relatives do it. So that's how I'm going to do it as well. No, when did Islam give you and I that permission? Islam didn't give us this permission. Islam didn't give us permission that just because your relatives do something some way, that then you have to do it that way as well. Yes, custom is important. Customs are important. Culture, very important. No doubt about it. You want to have some, these types of customs done at your wedding? No problem. That's not a problem. Customs and culture are never a problem in Islam, unless they start to become haram now. If they start to become haram now this is a test for you. Now you can't sit there and say, oh, well, this is how we do it in our family. Okay, well, during the time of the Prophet, there were many Muslims who could have said the same thing. Our relatives, this is how they do it. These are the idols that they worship, so we should be worshiping these idols as well. No, this is our test, brothers and sisters. where our relatives do things, just because my relative is doing this, that means I am supposed to do it the same way? I'm allowing that influence to play a role on me as well. This is how our relatives raise their children. So I'm supposed to raise my children in the same way? No. I have my own ideology, and I will be held accountable to my own ideology and my own lifestyle. Yes? This is why you find in the verses of the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, many times when He wants to speak about a person who's on the wrong path, you know what He says? He says this person is the person who, when he goes amongst his relatives agree with his lifestyle. When he goes amongst his relatives, none of his relatives say, why did you do this or why did you do that? They don't raise objection with his wrongdoings. No, they say, yeah, this is how we all do things. They're all fine together. And particularly the Quran says on the Day of Judgment, when this individual comes on the Day of Judgment and the book is going to be given to him, وَأَمَّا مَنْ أُوتِيَ كِتَابَهُ وَرَاءَ ظَهْرِهِ, the one who's given his book behind his back, meaning that he is amongst the wrongdoers, meaning that his place is in hellfire. فَسَوْفَ يَدْعُ ثُبُورًا, he wishes that he was dead. وَيَصْلَى سَعِيرًا, and then he says this, إِنَّهُ كَانَ فِي أَهْلِهِ مَسْرُورًا. But when he was with his relatives, when he was with his group, they were all happy together because they all did things the same way. They all supported one another. And these same relatives, brothers and sisters, who, if you choose to live a different lifestyle at times, it's not all of our relatives, some. The same relatives who, if you choose to live a different lifestyle, they will start to look upon you and frown upon you and say, oh, you're going to do it this way, or you're going to do it that way. And you say, well, listen, I want to do things based on custom and culture. It's just haram. If it wasn't haram, I wouldn't have a problem with doing it. You know, many times young men, I'm going off note here, and many times off script. Many times, brothers and sisters, younger brothers ask me, they say, well, in this wedding, they've asked me to do this. And weddings are just an example. This applies to every stage of your life. Ask me to do this, ask me to do that. This custom or that custom. No problem. If your elders want you to do a particular custom, do it. What's the problem with that? It's inconvenient for me. I don't like it too much. It's okay. Do it for them. Unless it reaches a point where it's haram. And the suggestion I always make is, if you are young, for example, and you are getting married, do those customs that are halal, do them, so that when it comes to the haram ones, you can ask your relatives to forgive you when it comes to that and not engage in that. Customs are important. Culture is important. Islam wants us to maintain our culture, but not when it comes to haram. That's where you have to draw the line. So you listen other places, so that when it comes to these haram habits, these haram customs, that is where you can draw the line. This is what I'm saying. Otherwise, customs, very important. Many times people will say, my father wants me to do this, but it's not necessarily religious for me to do it. I said, what do you mean it's not religious for you to do it? It means, well, there's no Quran or Hadith that says I should be doing it. You don't need Quran and Hadith. When your parents ask you to do something, you do it for them. The place you draw the line is if there's a situation, relatives, elders, they ask you to do something, or even youngsters at times. This can happen either way. They ask you to do something that is haram. That's where you draw the line. Otherwise, if an elder asks you to do something, do it. It's inconvenient for me. No, try your best. It's not going to ruin your whole life. It's a custom they like for you to do this, for example, this custom. What's the problem with this? If it's not haram, then try your best to make life pleasurable for them, and you will be rewarded for this. But Islam draws the line where these customs now reach the point where it is now turning into haram. Why? Because these same relatives that you say no to them when it comes to this haram, and they might look upon you and judge you, or they might look upon you and frown upon you, and they might look upon you like, we don't, you know, you're not making us proud. These same relatives on the Day of Judgment, they will show up. Then when they show up on the Day of Judgment, will they care for you? Will they carry the burden of your sin? No, they won't carry at all. They won't worry at all. They're worried about their own mistakes. On that day, people, each of them, they are worried with their own issues. They are concerned about their own issues. The Quran says, on that day, وَلَا يَسْأَلُ حَمِيمٌ حَمِيمًا. No close person, no close friend or relative is going to ask about another person. No one cares about each other on that day. And it's not because they don't run into each other. This is Surah Al-Ma'arij, verse 11 through 13. says it's not because they don't run into each other. No, they see one another. يُبَصَّرُونَهُم. We make sure that they see one another. They come across one another. But you know what the problem is? يَوَدُّ الْمُجْرِمُ لَوْ يَفْتَدِي مِنْ عَذَابِ يَوْمَئِذٍ بِبَنِيهِ وَصَاحِبَتِهِ وَأَخِيهِ وَفَصِيلَتِهِ الَّتِي تُؤْوِي. On that day, he doesn't care about his relatives. On that day, he's dealing with a punishment. He's willing to give his whole tribe to get rid of this punishment. If I do things because my relatives wanted me to do it, and we're talking about haram things, that's not an excuse. Because on the day where you need their help, they're not going to be there for you. They're not going to sit there, yes, Ya Allah, this person did this haram because of us. Please forgive him because of us. No, it's not how it works. وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. No one carries the burden of another person on that day. So as much as Islam has asked us to support our relatives, these are some of the places where we are to draw the lines. And you find in the lives of the prophets, they were tested with this difficult test. It's not an easy test. This is a difficult test. In the life of Musa alayhi salam, when Musa returned to Fir'aun, and of course, historically, if you look at the history of the story of Musa, you will realize that the Fir'aun that raised Musa is different from the Fir'aun, based on the mainstream opinion, from the Fir'aun that he returned to after he had become a prophet. This was the son of the previous Fir'aun. So in some ways you can say the brother of Musa. He says, when he returned back, what was the first thing that this new Fir'aun brought up? قال, when Musa said, believe in Allah and all of these things, what did he say? قال ألم نربك فينا وليدا ولبثت فينا من عمرك السنين. Aren't you the same one who we raised? You're from our relatives. You're part of our family. What is this you're talking about? You're going to go against us now? You're not going to agree with our lifestyle? You're the one that we raised. You lived with us for years and years. You were part of the family. But you see, Musa was tested with this difficult test, and of course he passed this test. Ibrahim was tested with the same test. These are difficult tests, because when Ibrahim, he had one person taking care of him, and that was his uncle. And within the Shia school of thought, of course, we don't believe that Azar was the father of Ibrahim. We believe that he was the uncle of Ibrahim. And when he turned away from the idols, what did Azar say? قَالَ أَرَاغِبٌ عَنْتَ عَنْ آلِهَتِي. You're going to turn away from these idols that I worship? Ya Ibrahim, it seems like we're going to have problems. لَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهِ لَأَرْجُمَنَّكَ وَهْجُرْنِي مَلِيًّا. So listen, either you stop or I'm going to kick you out. You can't stay with me anymore. And then the Quran continues. قَالَ سَلَامٌ عَلَيْكَ سَوْفَ أَسْتَغْفِرُ لَكَ سَأَسْتَغْفِرُ لَكَ رَبِّي إِنَّهُ كَانَ بِي حَفِيًّا. And the Quran says, Ibrahim responded to him. He said, I will pray for you. And I will pray for your forgiveness. And then the Quran says, when he turned away from this family, this uncles and this group of people who worship the idols, when he turned away, then we gave him a family of his own. فَلَمَّا اعْتَزَلَهُمْ وَمَا يَعْبُدُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. When he turned away from them, وَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ. Then we gave him his own family, which leads us to the final point that we will be making and wrapping up, inshallah. And this is the answer to the last question that we posed. If I am in a position where my relatives turn away from me and they cut off my support and they are not there to have my back, who am I supposed to rely on? When you go to Quran and Hadith, brothers and sisters, as much as we were talking about Rahim, we said these Rahim are your relatives. When you go to Quran and Hadith, you will find two different meanings for this concept of Rahim. Two different meanings for those who are, quote unquote, related to you. There are relationships, brothers and sisters, that are based on superficial things. They are based on apparent ties that we have with one another. Yes? This one is the niece of this one because he was born from this person. This one is the uncle of this person because he was born from this person. These are the ties that we have. And like we said, Islam has given importance to these ties. But at a deeper level, the relationships that matter to Quran and Hadith are the relationships that are based on truth and reality. What do I mean by this? It means that the individuals who you are truly related to, at this deeper meaning, are those who you are actually like, who you actually have similarities with them. It's a delicate point. So if I have similarities in my faith, in my belief with someone, I become a true relative of this person. And based on this structure, the true relatives of an individual, at the same time that at a lower level, this the family and the cousin and the aunt and the niece and the nephew, at a deeper layer, his relatives are no one. But the believers, and at the very top, the Ahlulbait. And this is why the hadith says, رُبَّ أَخٍ لَمْ تَلِدْهُ أُمُّكِ. How many brothers you have that your mother never gave birth to. There are brothers of yours, there are sisters of yours that your mother never gave to, meaning that you're closer to them at times than you are to your actual brother in terms of your bloodline. They are at a deeper layer. This is not to negate that you have siblings and relatives. No, this is all in Islam at a deeper layer. And this is why in the verses of the Quran you find when companions of Imam Sadiq came to him and they asked him about the meaning of the verses of the Quran, الَّذِينَ يَصِلُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلْ, those who connect and maintain the ties that they are supposed to maintain. He asked Imam Sadiq, he said, yes, this is Rahimu al Muhammad. This is the rahim of the family of the prophets. You can't cut off from them. And then as if to understand that this person was surprised, he said, listen, وَقَدْ تَكُونُ أَقَارِبَكَ. And maybe at a lower level, it also refers to your own relatives. And the Imam beautifully tells his companion, he says, don't be one of those who thinks that the verses of the Quran only has one layer of meaning. Don't be one of those who says, oh, I thought this was talking about our normal relatives. How can this be referring to the Ahlul Bayt? He says, no, it refers to your normal relatives. At a deeper level, the batin of the Quran, the hidden meaning, the esoteric meaning, whatever fancy words we want to use to refer to it, this is a deeper meaning of the verses of the Quran. This is the true rahim that you have. And then when we come across this hadith of the Prophet, when he says, أنا وعلي أبوا هذه الأمة. We are the fathers of this ummah. Now that we understand, this is not simply something that the Prophet is saying to make us feel good. The reality is that this ummah has a similarity with Ali ibn Abi Talib and the Prophet. They are the fathers of this ummah. This is the deeper connection that the human being has. And this is why in the seerah of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, you find when they used to come across individuals who had no one to support them, and their families had cut off from them, and they had no relatives, and they were living amongst the Muslimin, the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt used to remind them, listen, you have a family in us. This is why when the Prophet, one day he was sitting with his companions, they say Salman entered. And when Salman entered, the Prophet honored him and had him sit in the front of the majlis. And some of the people who were there, they were Arab. They didn't like this. They didn't like the idea of someone who's not related to the Prophet. He doesn't have relatives from the relatives of the Prophet. All of a sudden, he's being honored by the Prophet. And the Prophet turned to them. He said, listen, Salmanun minna ahlal bayt. Salman, we are his relatives. And with this hadith, beautiful hadith, I will end inshallah. The companion of the sixth Imam came to the sixth Imam. He said, Ya Aba Abdullah, whenever we talk to you, you speak quite a bit about Salman al-Farisi. You speak about Salman, the Persian Salman. You speak about Salman al-Farisi quite often. Why is it that you speak so often of Salman al-Farisi? And the Imam gave him 3 reasons. But before he even went into all of that, he said this. He said, لا تقل Salman al-Farisi, بل قل Salman al-Muhammadi. Don't say Salman al-Farisi. His relatives and his family is us. We are his true relatives. So even if all of the relatives in the world turn away from someone, this person needs to know that the Ahlul Bayt and the believers are his true family and his true rahim. With that, inshallah, we'll bring tonight's talk to an end. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we can support our relatives when we are obligated to do so, and that we can hold back from our support when we are obligated to do so. Let us take a moment to recite Surah Fatiha for all of our marhumin and marhumat, especially the marhumin and marhumat of the sponsors of tonight's program, with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
Now, Jazakallah, Shaykh, for the lecture. Inshallah, if Brother Muhammad Gohar can recite Ziyarat, inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا حبيب الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا سيد المرسلين، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيد نساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا مولانا إمام الحسن المجتبى، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله، السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام عليك يا سيدي ومولاي أبو الفضل العباس. السلام عليك يا أئمة المعصومين من ذرية الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا رحيم الغرباء، السلام عليك يا معين الضعفاء والفقراء، السلام عليك يا أنيس النفوس أيها المغفور من الفؤوس الراحم الحضر والخطر ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب العرش والزمان، السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان. أجل الله تعالى خيرك وسخر الله مخرج وظهورا وجعلنا الله من أعوانه وأنصاره. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Jazakallah, Brother Muhammad, for the Ziyarat. Inshallah, we will wrap up tonight. We will be having our last session with Shaykh Mahdi tomorrow, starting at 7:30. Inshallah, see you all there. Let's end this session